coming. My name is Tim Slaughter. I'm director of the Asia Pacific Dance Festival. I'm very happy to see all of you here this evening. We're excited to present this series of programs down at the beautiful Mission Memorial Auditorium that is run by the City and County of Honolulu, and they've been very gracious about having us. So thank you very much to Dave and his staff he's here soloing it tonight. Nobody helping him. But we're really excited to present these programs, and we'll be back here tomorrow night at 5 p.m. also for another one. So hopefully you will come back and join us again. And to pitch the dance festival, we also have, in addition to these events, on Friday we have the start of our conference, which has a keynote address with Marcus Marzan and Annie Lipscomb. That was free and open to the public. That's at Kennedy Theater, starting at 4 o'clock. They're going to do a wonderful presentation for everyone. That's followed by our welcoming ceremony at 6 o'clock, which is at the Friendship Circle with our partners in crime here, the East-West Center, which is sort of across the street from the Kennedy Theater. It's an open outdoor event. That one also is free. That is our using Hawaiian protocol to welcome our guest artist. If you do not know and you haven't read, we have copies of our festival guide out front that you're welcome to take a copy home with you. We have our guest, who I see in the audience tonight, from Cambodia, the Sophie Lynn Arts Ensemble. We also have our artist from Palau, which I do not see, and of course our hula from here in Honolulu. So we're excited for our performances this weekend on Saturday and Sunday. There are a handful of tickets left, so please get yours soon before they are all sold out. So before we start, I'd like to bring up to introduce our speaker for this evening, Miriam Stark. Miriam is director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and her specialty is Cambodia, right? Why don't you come? Oh, Eric's got you.
Where should I? Right here. It's great to be here tonight. Thank you so much. I can't believe we're doing this in person. It's a real treat, especially to have so many people who are here who love Cambodia, but also who love the Asia Pacific Dance Festival. So, aloha kako from our University of Hawaii at Mānoa Center for Southeast Asian Studies. My name is Miriam Stark, and I'm the center's current director. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Toni Shapiro-Phim as our speaker for this evening's lecture. Dr. Shapiro-Phim currently serves as Associate Professor of Creativity, the Arts, and Social Transformation at Brandeis University, where she's also a member of the Language, Culture, and Justice Hub. This academic hat, however, is only her most recent incarnation, and I want to tell you briefly about the rest of her career, which now spans several decades. Toni Shapiro-Phim is a cultural anthropologist and dance ethnologist who earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from Cornell University. Her research, writing, community work, and teaching all focus on the history and cultural contexts of the arts in discrete regions of the world, particularly in relation to violence, genocide, migration and refugees, conflict transformation, and gender. Toni has worked in Cambodian, Lao, and Vietnamese refugee camps in Indonesia and in Thailand, conducted years of ethnographic research in Cambodia, which is why I know Toni, and participated in training events with the Peace Building and Arts Initiative at Brandeis University. Now, before she joined Brandeis, she directed programs at the Philadelphia Folklore Project. It's a nonprofit arts and social justice organization in Philadelphia where she undertook more ethnographic research, curated exhibitions, produced performances, and collaborated, among other things, with Liberian women superstar recording artists to create an award-winning documentary film called Because of the War. Toni blends research with activism to broach tough issues concerning war, women, human rights, often but not always through the medium of performance, in classrooms, communities, on stages, and in refugee camps. She's actually also a very noted expert on Cambodian classical dance, and she's published on that as well. She's an academic, and she's taught at UC Berkeley, Yale University, and Bryn Mawr College at various points before Brandeis. She's published both on dance and social justice, the theme of tonight's lecture, and on the relationship between dance and Cambodian wars, on the ways that people in Cambodia and Cambodians in the diaspora use dance as an instrument to tell stories. It's her Cambodia research and advocacy work that brought us together, even in remote ways and not often enough. And Toni brings a lifetime of research and relationships and experience in Cambodia and with Cambodians to her work. It's really true, as I was writing this morning, that I cannot think of another living foreign colleague who works in Cambodia who is as deeply loved and cherished as is Toni Shapiro-Phim by her Khmer friends and colleagues. I'm very honored to introduce her tonight as your speaker. Please join me in welcoming her here.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Special thanks to Tim Slaughter and the festival organizers and staff, including Gage Thomas, our tech whiz, and to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, especially Miriam Stark, Charlotte Needham, Ariel Mota Alves, and Salun Nim. I want to offer enormous gratitude as well to University of Hawaii Emeritus Professor Judy Van Zyl, who for decades has expanded my thinking about ways of engaging with dance and its many possibilities for meaning. So tonight, I'm going to start with some questions. What if, in the context of flagrant abuses of human rights and of danger for anyone speaking out about such violations, dance somehow factored into the subversion of the status quo? What if, in a situation of deep-rooted prejudice, performance of movement and music turned ideas of who can and should do what in the world on their head? And what if, in the aftermath of state-sanctioned rape, a tribunal found that the creation of a new dance drama is an appropriate form of reparations for that crime against humanity? I'm going to introduce you to all of these what-ifs today, taking some time to tease out the relationship between dance and the seeking of justice. A 2022 report by Impact, that stands for the Imagining Together Platform for Arts, Culture, and Conflict Transformation, and the Global Community Arts Network, a report to which I contributed, notes that, I'll quote the report, constructively engaging with the urgent, complex challenges facing communities, humanity, and the planet requires insights from many different sources, including artistic and cultural practices, wisdom traditions, multiple scholarly disciplines, and practitioners of many kinds, including artists, peace builders, and other change makers. End of quote. In the circumstances we'll encounter today, dance takes its place alongside other efforts for constructive change, contributing to communities' abilities to counter injustice. In addition, the body, while central to the establishment of physical safety, is also the locus of renewal or re-establishment of community bonds, of a sense of continuity and connection, of a language of dignity and belonging, and a claim to the right to be and be in a certain space, as well as of harmony or rootedness within oneself. Dance and other body-centered forms of expression, as noted in the Impact report I referred to moments ago, through the ways they simultaneously animate our sensory, cognitive, and emotional faculties, invite engagement with the co-construction of meaning. They nourish capacities to negotiate ambiguity and paradox, and to unleash creativity and agency. A note regarding content. In this presentation, some of the stories deal with acts of inhumanity, which might very well stir up a range of emotions. So please attend to yourself. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, whatever you need to do. Let me get started with two stories, one centered in Chile and one in Japan. After that, we'll focus the remainder of our time on Cambodia, in part because that's where I've conducted the bulk of my research, as Miriam told you, and also because we are graced with the presence this week in Honolulu of accomplished Cambodian dancers who are participating in this festival and who are the very people about whom I'll be speaking. And we're blessed even more than in those ways because they're here with us tonight in this room. So Gage, we're ready for the next slide. We'll begin with a video. I'd love you to keep an eye on what's happening in this first clip so that we can note some elements of what a particular dance might mean in a given context. Take a look at who is dancing in terms of gender representation and age or generation. How many people are dancing and what is their relationship to one another on the dance floor? What are they wearing? What are they holding? How would you describe their physical movements? What they do with their arms or hands or feet? Okay. Watch the video. When I've asked questions about this clip to others, they've responded that the dancing seems celebratory. It seems like the dancers, a man and a woman, who often look at and circle around each other, are having fun. Some have pointed out that the woman is in a short dress with a ruffled skirt, while the man, her dance partner, seems cowboy-like with a hat and boots with spurs. They both do quick rhythmic steps and each holds a handkerchief. Next slide, thanks. This was a video clip of the cueca, known as the national dance of Chile. Some of you may know more about it than I do. Chile's music and dance traditions contain influences from indigenous communities and from people with roots in Africa and Europe as well. La cueca is considered a flirtatious dance, a courting dance generally performed by a man and a woman, and was traditionally done mainly in rural areas. In 1973, a coup d'etat ousted the democratically elected Salvador Allende and put the military dictator Augusto Pinochet into power, and everything changed. As he tightened his grip on the whole country, his regime declared in 1979 that the cueca was to be Chile's national dance, and it was incorporated into military parades. Symbols of unity and control were important to the dictatorship, as they have been elsewhere in the world, and in this case, dance was one of those symbols. Over the ensuing years, thousands of students, artists, intellectuals, and others were disappeared or murdered or went into exile, even on just an assumption or suggestion that they were anti-Pinochet. And tens of thousands were arrested and tortured. Many of those who disappeared to this day have not been accounted for. It was a regime rife with crimes against humanity. During the dictatorship, women, mothers, sisters, daughters, wives, decided to risk their lives and meet in a public square to dance the cueca, but instead of dancing in pairs, they danced alone. They'd show up in a plain white top and a dark skirt, and on their top was an image of their missing loved one. So as they danced alone, they were actually dancing with the person who had been taken from them. I learned about this phenomenon of La Cueca Sola through the writing of poet, human rights activist, and literary critic, Dr. Marjorie Agosin. This next clip I'll show you is of La Cueca Sola, the cueca danced alone. in the National Stadium after the dictatorship ended in 1990. What we'll see is part of the inauguration ceremony of the president who came into power right after Pinochet's dictatorship fell. That new president appears briefly in the video. La Cueca Sola was danced at this event as a way to call attention to the need to find or at least confirm information about those thousands who had been disappeared. Some of the lyrics you'll hear are as follows, translated into English. My life, at one time I was happy. My life, peaceful were my days. My life, but misfortune came. My life, I lost what I love the most. My life, at one time I was happy. I ask constantly, where are they keeping you? And nobody answers, and you don't come back. I ask constantly, where are they keeping you? And you don't return. My soul, long is the absence. Next slide, please. We can play the video. From afar, just with this tiny introduction, we can nonetheless sense the somberness of the atmosphere. This is a far cry from the celebratory moment of La Cueca danced in pairs that we saw earlier. I'd like to ask you, any of you here, what do you imagine might have happened as a result of the women creating and performing La Cueca Sola? What might have happened for them, for example, as they were performing in front of a government building, or what might have happened for people who passed by and saw them doing this? What can you imagine what impact that might have had for them or for others who saw them? Yes?
Since no one will speak, I think it could make them feel like they connected with their loved ones, but I also think they must have been terribly brave to do that because they were also risking their lives.
Yes, thank you. We're going to move on to another story now. That was Chile, and now we're going to look at a story in Japan. Next slide, please. Thanks. In In Japan, as many of you know, taiko ensembles are enormously popular. Taiko groups incorporate choreographed movement into their off-the-charts, vibrant, and forceful drumming. I'm about to share information that I learned from ethnomusicologist Dr. Terada Yoshitaka just this past April during a global forum on music and conviviality, on ways that individuals and communities reach across deep divisions through creative expression. Some of you might know much more about this than I do, and I'm sure all of us would love to hear from you at the end of my presentation, if that's the case. I was so moved and inspired by what Dr. Terada shared that I couldn't resist infusing a tiny bit of it into this presentation. Historically, it was a group of people known as buraku who made the drums. As members of a marginalized, in some ways outcast community, many had lived in substandard housing with limited access to higher education and certain jobs. Professions such as butchers and undertakers and work with animal hides were given to them, hence some were drum makers. Buraku community activism has resulted in important and far-reaching changes. Nonetheless, discrimination still exists. For example, there's a reluctance on the part of some Japanese who are not of Buraku descent to allow their children to marry those who are. Well, the folks who made the drums decided to add a creative arm to their body of work for rights and dignity. In 1987, one group in Osaka formed Ikari, a taiko ensemble, trained by a highly accomplished non-Buraku taiko artist. This ensemble became excellent. In a country in which taiko is revered, members of a Buraku community formerly relegated to drum making but not playing began to play superbly. More Buraku taiko groups sprang up, also developing to the highest standards. And in some of these ensembles now, there are more non-Buraku than Buraku because people want to be part of a group with excellent artistry. In 2014, several Buraku taiko groups combined talent and became kizuna. And in 2022, the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka produced a concert featuring kizuna. Here are some clips put together from their performance shared with the museum's permission. Next slide, please. They drum primarily to eradicate Buraku discrimination, but also to raise consciousness about human rights in a broader sense. Mainstream society's continuing negligence to acknowledge the taiko makers' contribution to Japanese culture and history led to the establishment of that taiko group I mentioned earlier, Ikari, which means anger or rage. That's the name of that original group. Nowadays, Through Kizuna's riveting performances, they have become the face of the community to the outside world, while their activities serve as an important venue for intergenerational and interregional communication, end quote, by Dr. Terada. Along with the performance, a panel discussion of Buraku historical and contemporary lived experience was held on stage at the museum and live streamed. This was a rare, open discussion about prejudice and discrimination against Buraku and paths to justice. Our third and final story is situated in Cambodia. Next slide, please. For centuries, classical dancers in Cambodia have brought particular mytho-historical characters to life in elaborate dance dramas. They've also performed ritual pieces without set storylines. It has been through sacred movement and music, through performances by dancers and musicians, that the royalty communicates with the heavens, seeking blessings, including rain, for the land and people of Cambodia. The form of dance we're looking at today is called classical or court dance. Next slide, please. We have some of the stars right here. For centuries, the dancers most often represent princes, princesses, giants, or ogres, and monkeys or celestial beings. In the mid-20th century, this kind of dance, along with its royal and spiritual ties, became theatrical entertainment as well. Although this remains the case today, with dancers on makeshift or grand stages and at celebratory or sacred events, the upheavals of the late 20th century resulted in enormous loss of people and repertoire, and to shifts in possibilities. I'm going to speak to you about dancers in Cambodia who, instead of embodying mythic beings like you see here, interpreted stories and experiences of cruelty and suffering as part of a reparations project associated with the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, officially known as the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. I'll be sharing what they shared with me about this new extension of their charge as performers. I'll start with some background context and then return to the dancers and what they faced. Next slide, please. This is an image of a 2013 dance called A Bend in the River. Its storyline adapted from a Cambodian folktale. Even recent pieces in the classical idiom, such as this one, pieces that reflect contemporary concerns with innovative costuming and choreography. You see the difference, no golden headdresses and heavy silk and brocade, plus some additional accoutrements. Even these, though, have relied on a mythical quality to the characters on stage. Next slide, please. Now, in the instance we'll be focusing on, the dancers were not playing the part of mythical characters, but of actual people, some still alive and in the audience watching them. The artists were tasked with communicating the excruciating agony and brutality experienced and inflicted by people in their parents' and grandparents' generations. A noted specialist in trauma, Bessel van der Kolk, has written that the past is alive in the bodies of those who have experienced trauma, alive in physiological, psychological, emotional, and somatic ways that may interfere with the ability to live fulfilling lives. While we recognize that indeed experiences of this sort I'll be talking about may imprint themselves in people's beings and in communities, I'd like us to also consider what happens to the bodies and emotions and minds of those positioned to interpret for the public other people's experiences of violence and loss. I'm talking about the dancers themselves. The agony and brutality that the dancers I'll be introducing to you recreated and represented on stage had not been theirs, had not been part of their personal past, but became alive in their bodies and hearts as they danced the stories, and in some instances stayed alive in them for longer than they had liked. Just a note, Khmer is the official name of the majority ethnic group of Cambodia and the language. But the words Khmer and Cambodian are often used interchangeably in English, and I'll be using them both. Next slide, please. A civil war fought between Khmer Rouge communists and Cambodian government forces had begun in the 1960s and intensified during the early 1970s. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge declared victory. Ruling over a nation they named Democratic Kampuchea, they forced most of the urban population into the countryside, where communally organized living and working conditions, lack of resources, and seething distrust and violence resulted in mass starvation and in death from disease, torture, and execution. Next slide, please. Children were often separated from and turned against their parents, some spying on their mothers and fathers at the leadership's behest. For the most part, schooling was eliminated, as were markets and any form of religious worship. All loyalty was to be paid to a kind of amorphous entity called Angka, which means literally organization. By the end of almost 4 years of Khmer Rouge rule, between a quarter and a third of the country's entire population had perished. One of the most insidious practices of the Khmer Rouge project of refashioning society into one in which loyalty was to be shown only to the regime, not to family, friends, or faith communities, was forced marriage. It served as a strategy to raise a large army of youth controlled by the authorities. It also continued the government's assault on intimate bonds and rewarded cadres. Officials paired individuals and forced them under threat of torture or death to marry. Punishment awaited those who did not consummate the marriage. Spies would follow them home and make sure that they had. This was institutionalized rape. The testimonies of survivors are horrific, resistance having been harshly quashed. The Khmer Rouge regime was overthrown in 1979. It took almost 3 decades, though, until 2007, for a Khmer Rouge tribunal to become operational. Next slide, please. This is the court, this is the building of the court, at which some of those deemed most responsible for crimes against humanity and for genocide were tried. In 2016, as a case that recognized forced marriage as a crime against humanity was being considered, a proposal was approved by the court for a reparations project specifically for survivors of forced marriage. All those years after having lived through the nightmare, some survivors chose to become what are known as civil parties. Those are people impacted directly by the crimes investigated by the court, who also applied to take part in the proceedings and request reparations. Survivors worked with a choreographer of Cambodian classical dance to create a dance drama based on their testimonies. This new dance was to be a form of collective and moral reparation, an initiative aiming to recognize hurt and injury suffered, and also to bring a degree of redress. They chose a classical dance drama as their form of reparations because of the aesthetic, moral, and spiritual potency of the art. As I mentioned a moment ago, it was through the dancers that the Cambodian royalty would communicate with the heavens, thereby fostering the fertility of the land and the well-being of the people. While classical dance has been democratized, it is still for many a symbol of the nation and still connected to ideas about the country's well-being. Khmer Rouge leaders, while in power from 1975 to 79, had officially forbidden performance of classical dance and forced a formulaic revolutionary dance and music repertoire on the populace. They did this because the classical tradition connected people to a history, community, and mythology with which the Khmer Rouge did not want to compete for loyalty. Had this form of dance and its layers of cultural and historical significance not posed a threat, it might have been ignored rather than banned. The full title of this official reparations initiative is Gasla Bram Angka, Areca Flowers Under Angka, the ruling body of the Khmer Rouge. Next slide, please. The project was originally proposed by scholar Teresa de Lenges and undertaken collectively by the Transcultural Psychosocial Organization, TPO, Gede Karuna, a non-governmental peace-building agency that curated a traveling exhibition and community conversations, the Bopana Audiovisual Resource Center that recorded oral histories and made a documentary film of the whole project, and Khmer Arts, where the Kasla dancers, members of the Sobilin Arts Ensemble, were based, along with survivors. Tibio, Gede Karuna, and Bopana have long histories of trauma-informed engagement with Khmer survivors and of documentation of their experiences. Next slide, please. Gasla's choreographer, Sophie Lynn Shapiro, has been creating new dances based squarely in Cambodian classical tradition for the past 2 decades, including A Bend in the River, which we saw a picture of earlier. She survived starvation, disease, and overwork to become part of the first post-genocide generation to recreate tales of the past through performance. She's also my sister-in-law, and the story of that happened is deserving of its own dance drama, which maybe she will choreograph one day. 50 survivors of forced marriage met with Sophie Lynn, watched a demonstration of her work, and agreed that she should proceed to choreograph some of their stories. She met with 100 survivors over the course of months of imagining, teaching, and rehearsing the dance. This is in rehearsal. The survivors watched, asked questions, offered critiques and suggestions. Ultimately, as represented through performance, experiences that had in some instances triggered shame and whose suppression had kept people feeling isolated were generating empathy and a sense of dignity and connection, along with contributions to the historical record. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is a video clip of Sophie Lynn explaining and demonstrating some of the creative process. We'll meet her mid-sentence. At the end of this footage, you'll see Sophie Lynn working with 2 dancers, one who appears menacing from above and another on her knees who seems afraid. We'll see this movement sequence again later when I show you a clip from a performance of the Gasla. So let's play the video.
រឿងរ៉ាវឈឺចាប់របស់គាត់ឲ្យពួកយើងសកលក្រៅនេះបានស្ដាប់ដំណាក់កាលទី2គឺយើងនឹងសរសេរជារឿងលក្ខណៈរបាំបុរាណបែបទំនើបមួយដើម្បីឲ្យគេបានដឹងនិងទទួលស្គាល់ថាការបង្ខំបែបនេះគឺជាប្រតិកម្មរបស់សម្រាប់ពលរដ្ឋបានធ្វើទៅចំពោះពួកគាត់
Next slide, please. Throughout the dance, reference is made to the beauty and potency of the traditional Cambodian wedding ceremony, which can last for days, involving complex rituals with discrete musical pieces, myriad offerings, and numerous changes of elaborate dress for both groom and bride. Next slide, please. These were all absent, so before what you saw was a picture of a traditional Cambodian wedding ceremony, and this is a picture of a Khmer Rouge era forced marriage ceremony. There were no friends, no family, and no invoked spirits at these ceremonies. Only some officials and other couples whom you see on the side, also partnered without choice, were present. The narrators in the dance drama Gasla lament the stark lack of ritual in their ceremonies and grieve over having gone through something so profound without the comfort of their loved ones, especially their parents, extended family, and community members who should feature so prominently in the ceremony. Thus, the violation was not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. Next slide, please. In one scene of Gasla, a woman puts up a fight, refusing to marry under such circumstances. She had already been married. Her husband, it turns out, was led away, only to be slaughtered by the very man who later wanted to claim her as his new bride. She is dragged to prison, where she leads a revolt. But let's get back to the dancers for a moment. I want to add that I've known all of the dancers for more than a decade, since I spent 2 years, 2008 to 2010, in the Khmer Arts compound, working with them. And I've known Sophie Lynn much longer. In this dance piece, the artists move with the same fluidity and grace and energy through the extremities that are essential to the Khmer classical dance aesthetic. Weight is held centered and low, knees are mostly bent, Toes curve upward, the back is arched, and fingers curl back into a half moon. Yet in this dance, they are thrown and tortured, wrapped in sacks and left for dead. The innovation adds another dimension of relevancy to the form. It can convey myths and stories of celestial beings and royalty. Classical dance can also share the real-life plights of Cambodians themselves. Next slide, please. This is a clip from the dance drama of the Khmer Rouge rounding pairs up to be forced to marry. Most Cambodian classical dance roles are performed by women, even the roles of male characters, and in Gasla, all the roles are played by women. This clip is a little bit dark, I apologize. I want you to try to look for that rehearsal sequence we saw when somebody looms over another person. We'll play the clip now, thank you. In addition to stylized depictions of struggle, nuanced considerations of contrasting perspectives feature as well. For example, after one woman forced to marry a Khmer Rouge soldier pushes him into a well where he dies, she, who was then brutalized, and he appear in spirit form, talking through their different takes on what it means to try to build a just society. He had joined the revolution for what he believed had been its ideal goals. Next slide, please. Gasla has drawn crowds of hundreds to each performance in both urban and rural settings in Cambodia. There's always a special space in the front for survivors of forced marriage. They sit together with Cambodian counselors among them to offer a hand to hold or a shoulder to cry on. I want to note that while survivors of forced marriage are both male and female, it is overwhelmingly many more women than men who became civil parties in this case and have told of their suffering. Many survivors reported to TPO researchers that they felt honored by having their stories presented in these particular art forms, as both classical dance and Binpiat music carry enormous cultural resonance. They told Sobilin repeatedly that what was presented on stage echoed their personal experience, and that the narration put into words what they had long wanted to say, and for some, long wanted to reveal to their loved ones. The stories in Gasla give a public forum to survivors and also inspire dialogue about gender violence in general and its relationship to the legacies of the Khmer Rouge during facilitated post-performance discussions. Almost 2/3 of Cambodia's population is under 30. Education about the past contributes to new thinking about possibilities for the future for both survivors and members of younger generations. Dancer Sovandi shares that she often wants to cry while dancing in Gasla, feeling her heart break as she becomes one with her character. If I heard that much, she says, imagine the depth of suffering of those who were actual victims of forced marriage. Next slide, please. Her colleague, Rin Srelep, says that once she throws my true self away and becomes a vicious Khmer Rouge cadre on stage, she sees actual tears on the face of the dancer portraying the one she is abusing. After a performance, she allows herself to grieve for the one she hurt and for Cambodia, though one time, this is what she told me, this feeling that I was that man stayed with me for a month. It was so demanding to take on his character that she held him right under the surface so that she would be ready for the next performance and the next. I couldn't be fully myself, she said. Other dancers had nightmares or upset stomachs. They state publicly and believe that they are doing good. Younger generations learn more about their history and consider the impact of unequal gender relations, and survivors have acknowledgement. Meanwhile, the dancers take on the ruptures of dignity, family, and body of those whose experiences they communicate. So Bilin too carries the weight of reliving her harrowing past. Each of the organizations involved was holistic in their care for survivors, for the stories and history, and even for the artists. A TPO psychologist mentioned the possibility of a training in self-care to the dancers and musicians, but it fell through the cracks as people were so busy. Perhaps in the future, paying attention to their well-being should be a required element. One of the dancers even came face to face with the fact that she's a product of a forced marriage. I mentioned the impact on the dancers to add a layer to our consideration of dance and the seeking of justice. The stories shared today point to, as Wendy Harcourt writes in the book, Rethinking Transitional Gender Justice, a quote, the need for seeing the delivery of justice as a shared project, end quote. Policymakers and artists, scholars, scientists, community organizers, lawyers, and educators, and those most impacted by the injustice at hand, of course, all together create the means to address complex challenges. Sometimes a certain kind of movement, certain forms or styles of dance in discrete contexts can spark a sense of solidarity, continuity, possibility, defiance, and or imagination. In Chile, it was the national dance that was reworked. They didn't show up and do the cha-cha, for example. In Japan, buraku communities refused limits imposed on them and now shine in an honored traditional practice which they used to serve as instrument makers. And in Cambodia, survivors of forced marriage reclaimed the narrative, contributing to a reclamation of agency and dignity as well. Just last month, the International Center for Transitional Justice published a paper entitled Catalyzing Transformative Change, the Power of Art and Culture to Inspire Action. Next slide, please. In that paper, they explain that rarely can technical and institutional methods alone fully express people's suffering and resistance to oppression. Art and other forms of cultural expression help us question our beliefs and assumptions about reality. Art can help people identify and empathize with the experiences of others and promote a deeper understanding of our shared humanity. End quote. Next slide. Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions today. Before I open it to questions, I would love to introduce you to the real stars of the evening. Choreographer Sophie Lynn. Sova Lee, Salsa Lee, Mokharan, Sao Pyung, Long Chanteri, El Contiero, and Hikoyo. I'm so happy they're here tonight. So I'd be happy to take a couple of questions if there are any.
A question maybe more to the performers in the process of creation
So this is a question for the artists. Maybe Sophie Lynn, you could help with this. I'll repeat the question. Yeah. The question is, in the process of creating Gasla, the dance drama, how was the music created?
Thank you. So, for Gasla, this is our third production that I work with Dr. Humanities, who was a teenager during the Khmer Rouge, and I was a kid during that time as well. And so, how we develop the music is that, so we have the storyline, and then I meet with him, and I propose to him that for this particular production, we would like to use quintet ensemble, but we would like to have a new score. And to develop the new score, we both read the scripts that I wrote, and then we divide up into minutes. So let's say this scene, maybe the music can be 3-4 minutes and things like that. But most importantly is that the vision itself, and that we want to provoke the deep, sad feeling of the suffering of our people, or the fear of the situation itself. So, for example, when the Khmer Rouge drag people in from the rice paddy to the communal kitchen, that's where they usually take place, the wedding take place, and lines up. And then the Khmer Rouge, they make the announcements of the glories of the revolution and things like that. So music can be expressing this sense of the revolutionary celebrations and the power that the revolutionaries cast over the people. And so these are the kind of things we are talking about, the rise and fall of the music will express a certain feeling and a certain the magnitude of the scene itself. But by not using any other type of instrument, but focusing on Cambodian traditional and classical instrument. However, Dr. Humanities had studied in the Soviet Union at the Tchaikovsky Conservatory of Composition of Western Symphony. And so try to connect the technique of composition of violins and piano and all of that, and transfer the same technique to Cambodian ensemble, which is xylophones and gongs and drums, oboe, things like that. He even creates some other instruments out of clay, because that instrument creates sounds that reflects the sound of a wolf howling. So at one scene, actually you will see on Saturday, at one scene when TV, who is the characters who push her forced married husband down the well, when they argue over the effects of the revolution, she mentioned that, look, because that soldier was a blind soldier, he lost his eye for the revolution, for the war. And so she said, if you can see, you will see that around you are graveyard, and these graveyard at night, the wolf will come and they howl to call each other to come if they could they find, any bodies that was lying there. And so these are the things that encourage or inspired sounds, natural sound, or sounds of the heartbeat, or of crying, sobbing, things like that we could incorporate into our piece, and also create musical sound that reflects of these kind of sounds that is meaningful, and it was happening at the time.
Somebody mentioned Saturday night, and the ensemble will be in performance at the Kennedy Theater Saturday night.
Can you share a little bit about how young people, children, may learn about Cambodian history in school or at home? Like in Hawaii, we have some traumatic times of history that wasn't spoken about in the family because it was too devastating. I'm curious if young children we talk about what happened in Cambodia, their families, or in schools.
Let me repeat the question just so everyone could hear. It's that the question is about young people, children in Cambodia today. Do they know about this traumatic history? Are they taught? Because in Hawaii, correct me if I'm wrong when you said that, there also is a traumatic past that many people don't know about, many of the younger generations don't know about.
Sorry, I'm a little bit cold. Shivering. I think in school, in 1980, soon after the Khmer Rule was over, in school there's certain paragraph for children to learn. They just a very superficial description that student know. But soon after the Khmer Rule, art troops was a lot of theater pieces was created about the Khmer Rules, but it's more like a therapeutic, expression, because at that time everybody just came back from wherever they were evacuated to or taken to, and now they come back and start to build up life again. But at that time, people were just performing almost no story, no other story but about the Khmer Rule. But it's really direct, very straightforward, or whatever they see, what happened in their village, they put on the stage. But as far as in school, later on, I think children are still knowing it, but it's very short, very small amount. And school, we have the museum of the genocidal museum, but somehow the Ministry of Education, I think we don't have programs where school students will go to the museum and see it in regular basis. So maybe family can take their children there, but I think parents are not shy about telling their children. So we like to share. And sometimes when let's say my generation, when we meet each other, we say, oh, hello, and then, oh, where do you live during the Khmer Rouge? You know, that was a kind of point of connection, that we don't mind sharing the story. For kids, I think, yes, we want to know, but we also want to move forward. And this is why
my piece called Niang Niet Devi, which is part of seasonal migration, will perform on the first piece we perform on Saturday. That's reflecting that sense of, yes, it's part of us, but I don't want to be part of. I don't want it to be attached to me, but I can't tear it off. When I told my uncle, who is a kind of guru, cultural and art guru, and a person who steered the wheel for revival of the art after the Khmer Rouge, I told him that I would like to create a piece that related to a female serpent who doesn't like her own tails. And he said, you know what is the power of a serpent? Where the power of a serpent? She said it's in her tails. And now you don't like your own tails? And so, anyway, but I said, well, I didn't mean that power. It's not a magical power. But this serpent is a serpent that has a tails, or long tails, and that part of her tails are very, very sad. We don't want to. So in this case, that even though this serpent want to tear off her tail, but she couldn't because it hurts, and so finally she learned to accept her tails. And I think that to a lot of Cambodian young people, when they watch the piece, this piece is kind of reminding them and say, our history, both what you like and what you don't like, what you feel proud of, what you don't feel proud of. You can't throw it away, it stays. And so you have to find a way to accept it, but not letting it kind of crush you. You have to find a way to understand it and grow from it. There's a lesson to follow and there's a lesson to avoid. And that would be a lesson to avoid.
When Sophie Lynn mentioned the museum of the genocide and that there probably aren't school trips going to visit, it reminded me of DC Cam, the Documentation Center of Cambodia. It's a private organization that has amassed an incredible archive of material from the Khmer Rouge years, and they've done a remarkable job of developing educational materials more recently. They have a high school curriculum, which they've taken around the country. And during the trial, at that building that we saw here, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, they made an effort to bring people in from all over the country to sit and witness some of the trial sessions to get education about that period out to the populace.
Can I add something too? I agree with Finland's assessment of the Khmer Rouge content inside our education system in Cambodia. I just happened to talk with the director of the Tulsa Genocide Museum yesterday. So the focus of the Ministry of Education after the Khmer Rouge has always been to replenish human resources to revive Cambodia's economy. So a lot of the effort have been on math, on science, but less on history, including cultural history, like not just the recent history, especially with the Khmer Rouge. I remember in the 80s, there was only one paragraph in the textbook about the Khmer Rouge, but it's mostly about chronology. But recently, the content for the Khmer Rouge curricula is only around 10% per year. So it's very limited. People want to talk about it, but the assumption has always been that everyone knows what happened, right? But to talk in the U.S. term, like the Gen X and Gen Z, they are very different. I'm from the end of the Gen X era. We still remember what our parents told us, but my younger siblings who were born after the 1985, they question the fact that it happened, the fact that the Khmer can kill people en masse. For them, it just doesn't make any sense. Right? But just to add to that, the Tu Slai Museum, the Genocide Museum in Cambodia now has created more events to attract school students, mostly in the capital city, who came to this museum, which was called S21, a high security prison under the Khmer Rouge. But so what they've been successful so far is that private schools in the capital will send the students over to this museum and get educated about the Khmer Rouge. And with their outreach now, they have teachers from the province who did fundraiser among the students, and they would take students with buses from central Cambodia, from southern Cambodia to visit the museum. So in general, on top of the DC camp, the Tu Slai Museum, we see a current trend among younger generation to revisit this painful history. So that's all I want to add. Thank you.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much. This was really interesting and educational, and I think everybody enjoyed it. And for me, it seems like you're really passionate about dance, about culture, about certain social issues around it. And my question is, what made you decide to dedicate a huge part of your life towards Cambodian dance, Cambodia, and Cambodian culture? Because it seems like you're passionate about dance overall, so why Cambodian dance, and why not something else?
Thanks. It's a long story, but I'll make it short. When I see you later, I can tell you more. In part, or maybe I'll say originally, when I heard some news, I mean, this was way back when Cambodia was suffering the genocide, and shortly thereafter, that was before the age of the internet, so we couldn't just Google and find out what was happening. We were relying on television news reports and the newspaper. But I remember hearing at the time about the impact of the United States and our military in Southeast Asia, and I was devastated, felt some kind of responsibility, seeing thousands of people leaving Vietnam by boat and people going overland from Cambodia to Thailand seeking refuge from such hardship. And I wanted to try to understand what was happening. It's a long story I'll skip over, but I ended up getting a job in a refugee camp. It was on an island in Indonesia. Indonesia is made up of thousands of islands and hundreds of islands, and this was an abandoned military base, so the Indonesian military gave it over to the United Nations so that refugees escaping from Vietnam by boat could be led there and land there and stay until something was figured out for them. Well, I went there to work in an educational program, and there on this island, 10,000 people from Vietnam were on one part of the island, and there, that's where I was working in an educational program, and I saw poetry writing, wood carving, even rock and roll music. The International Red Cross brought in instruments and generators, and they had some bands going. But on the other side of the island, for some reason the UN had brought some people some Cambodians who had escaped to Thailand down to this island in Indonesia, because Cambodians didn't escape by boat and get there. Only 300 people from Cambodia on that side of the island, and they had just survived a genocide. They had no idea where their children would ever go to school, if ever again, where they would get enough drinking water. And in this kind of, even though it was a UN-run camp, it was not pleasant environment. And what were they doing? 300 people. They were teaching their children how to dance. And I'm not saying that every Cambodian dances or cares about dance or would do that, but when I saw that, in part because I had studied dance all my life, so maybe I noticed that and didn't notice a lot of other things that were going on, but in part I thought, I was born and raised in Philadelphia, and if 300 people from Philadelphia were isolated, exiled to some godforsaken island with nothing and no idea about their future, having lost everything, what would we do? And Philadelphia is multi-ethnic, multicultural, much more so than Cambodia, but I don't know if we beat each other up or play baseball, I just don't know. But the Cambodians, and this was nobody from the Royal Institute of, Royal University of Fine Arts, or it was mostly farmers. They had been farmers who had suffered so much, all this loss. And my interpretation was, where I really didn't know, but later I came to see that to be alive as a Cambodian meant to move this way, to sing this way, they made instruments and recreated aspects of their culture. I was totally blown away by that. So I then got a job in a refugee camp with Cambodians on the Thai-Cambodian border and saw the same thing. And then even later when Cambodians, some of the refugee camps were in a war zone because all the different factions who had ruled Cambodia in the past were all fighting each other and fighting against the people in power. And so refugees would gather in these camps, which again were just places of horror for many. No shade, right in the tropics. Hot as can be, makeshift stages, and thousands of people would come out to watch their fellow Cambodian refugees dance. And then artillery shells would drop from the war, and people would scatter, look for their kids, jump into trenches, and when the shelling stopped, they'd go back and finish the show. So I was just overwhelmed, like what could this possibly mean, that people would make these choices? And again, it doesn't mean every Cambodian would do that, but it was enough. So I decided to treat myself to a year of graduate school, and from rural Thailand I wrote my applications, or I asked for material from different universities, and thought if I get a scholarship to one, I'll just go for a year, just so I can try to understand what I'm witnessing. And guess what? Cornell gave me a scholarship, so I said, okay. And when I got their catalog, I decided, dance in a refugee camp, what could you study? You could study political science. You could study religion, because it has to do with spirituality. You could study art history or theater and dance, all kinds of things. But I opened the catalog and saw something called anthropology, which said the study of humankind. I thought, well, that sounds good. I didn't even know what it was, but I applied and got in. And Cornell didn't offer just a master's. You had to apply for the PhD, so I applied, honestly thinking I would go for a year, just to treat myself to try to understand this. And I ended up staying, loved my colleagues, kept learning more and more. And I wanted to go into Cambodia to compare, what I had seen in the refugee camp. But back in those days, the US and Cambodia were enemies. Cambodia was communist, was a friend of Vietnam, the enemy of the United States. There was no embassy, US embassy in Cambodia. I wasn't allowed in to research. But I had written an application to an organization in New York, Social Science Research Council, that gives money to students to do their dissertation research abroad. And they contacted me and said, oh, sorry, we can't even consider your application because you aren't allowed in Cambodia. But by a miracle, someone from the Social Science Research Council was invited to Cambodia and met with people at the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Education. And the people from New York said, in the future, when diplomatic relations are restored, what would you like from us? What kind of help would you like? And they said, we would like someone to help us document our dance tradition. So the moral of the story is, they opened their briefcase and said, we know a student. And then I got a visa, and from Thailand went into Cambodia. Anyway, so that was the start. That's why Cambodia. And since then, I've been very, very lucky to have worked with people in different contexts from different cultural communities and different histories, but many of them refugees or survivors of war, and have been blown away again and again by people's creativity in the face of such horror and loss. And it doesn't mean that what anyone went through is okay because now they can dance. It doesn't mean that at all. It means people are sometimes just so brilliant in ways that they can foster community, nurture family, imagine possibilities beyond the horror that they're living at that time through cultural expression that really matters to them, like Cambodian dance that has to do with the spirits of the earth and water that travel within people. You know, like the dance in Chile was the national dance that had, you know, that through turning it into something else, turned the whole narrative of what the national government was saying on its head. You know, so that stuff keeps me going.
Thank you very much, Toni. Thank you, Miriam, and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for sponsoring tonight's program. Thank you, Sophie Lynn, for being here and sharing with us. Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you will both come Saturday and Sunday. It's two totally different programs where you will see Sophie Lynn's group perform, as well as two other groups, one from Palau and one here from Honolulu. And if you're interested, please come back tomorrow night, same time, 5 o'clock, for the preview, the U.S. preview? Yes?
Yes.
I think so, yeah. Of a film called The Perfect Motion. And Toni will lead us afterwards in a short little conversation about the film. So 5 o'clock tomorrow, so thank you all very much. And it's a pleasure having you on behalf of the Asia Pacific Dance Festival, the University of Hawaii, and the East-West Center. I want to thank you, and everybody be safe, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow.